Hello friends and welcome back to another web developer path video. In this one we are going to talk about the more advanced features of JavaScript, at least some of them. And this is basically part 2 of my previous video, which was the basics of JavaScript. So let's get started. I have my HTML document ready and all I want to do is just to create an app.js file so we can work in that one. And don't forget to use the script tag and the source attribute to say where is that app.js. There we go. So now we can just say log, for example, and say hi, and there we go. We have it in the console. I'm going to close the sidebar and let's get started. So first we have variables, let and const. And in the previous video we talked about this, but let's recap. Let can be declared but don't need to be initialized at first. So if we log that x down here, we would not get any error. We would get undefined, which is undefined, of course. If we assign something to x, that would not be a problem. If we reassign it, that would also work. With const, however, we cannot do that. So if I say const x equals to, if I say const x, it says you need to initialize it first. And okay, I say let's do that. But if I want to reassign it, of course, that gives me an error too, because const cannot be reassigned. The other thing is let and const are scoped variables. And let me show you what that means. If I create an if statement here that would return true, and then just say var x is 10, and I'm using var to show you the old ways, and you can see x is outside of the if statement, but if I save it, I still get that 10 in the console. However, if I change this to let, that would not work because let and const, they are block scoped. That means they are only accessible within the block of a function or an if statement and so on. So this curly brackets is a block. Next, we have template string and some string methods. So for example, I'm going to create a username variable and I'm going to just say my name. And if I log that username down here, we would of course get that. Now in the old ways, if we wanted to concatenate something to this, we would just say, for example, hi plus the variable, and we would get what we wanted. Now with template string, we don't have to do this. All we have to do to use backticks and then type whatever we want to and then inject the dynamic variable using this syntax. So $, curly brackets, and the name or the expression. So we can even do expressions within this. So if I say if x is, I don't know, like John, like this, then say it says false because now this is a if statement. All right, let's talk about some of the methods, a string method. So I have that username and I want to check if it includes something that I pass into it. Does it include on? That's right. Does it include jon? No, that's false because it's case sensitive. So it's capital J. All right, so it doesn't matter the position. It just checks if that expression includes in that variable, which is a string. Next, we have starts with, and it checks if the variable string we have here starts with the value or the argument we passed into the function. And it's true because it does start with capital J-O-N. If I say O-N, that would be false. If I say only J, that would be true. And I can just go on and on, like that. That would be true. But if I make a mistake, then would be false. This takes a second argument. So this starts with takes a second argument as the starting position or index. So strings are pretty much like arrays. They start from 0, 1, 2, and so on. So if I say I want to start at 3, so at the index of 3, which is inclusive, it goes like 0, 1, 2, 3. So it starts at V. So if I say, does the sentence or does that string start with V? That's true. Okay, so again, 0, 1, 2, 3, that's V. We have the opposite way that goes ends with. This is similar to start with, but this position is kind of funny. Let me just first, without the second argument, let's just say, does it end with R? Yes. AR? Yes. Now, this also takes a second argument, and we can say, take the position 3. Now, this is, again, like I said, it's kind of funny because what it does, it takes that position we passed into it minus the length of the string, which is 8 in this case, and that would give us 5, and then goes back 5 index. So it goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, stops at the end. So if I say, does it end with n? That's true. Let's jump to array and object methods. So we have some array methods or object methods, and for that I'm going to just paste an array of objects that I copied from the internet. So it's just an array of 10 cars. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to format this one and just log, or actually let's say console.dir cars. So we see this would be our first, initial array, and we're going to do some methods. We're going to apply some methods to it. The first one is map, and map would return another array. So if I say cars.map, this would take a callback function, and I can say for each car in the cars array, I'm not using parentheses because I have only one parameter. And then I know each car has 3 key value pairs. So I want to just bring back the model. I'm sorry. Yeah, let's say model. So let's say car model. So this would return an array. So we can actually either save it or just console.log this one. So I'm going to put it in the parentheses. And in the beginning, I'm just going to say console.log that one. And you can see now I have an array of 10 car models. So I'm using arrow functions for these ones, and I will use it throughout this course, but I will talk about the functions in the next section. And you can see I don't need to use the return keyword when I'm using arrow functions because I have only one statement. If I had more than one, then I needed to use the curly brackets. I don't need to use the parentheses because I have only one parameter. If I had more than one, or if I had none, I had to use them like this. So keep that in mind. We're going to jump to the next one, filter. So filter returns an array like map based on a condition. So this would actually ask for a condition. I want to check that if a car year, so they have a year, is greater than 2000. So it is made after 2000. And I have an array of 4 objects that are made, or 4 cars that are made after the year 2000. There we go. So that's quite handy, and I think we talked about this in the previous video too. By the way, don't worry, I have a note file which will be linked in the description after the video. I'll put it in there, and it has all these methods and all the things that we will see in this video. All right, let's jump to the next one. So I'm just going to delete this one, keep the log. Next one, we have sum. The sum function determines if the condition that we pass into it is met for any element of the array. Okay, so let me show you with an example. So we want to say cars.sum, again, takes a callback function for each car in that array. Check if the car make is Ford, for example, with a capital F, of course. Now, if I save it, it gives me true. Now, the keyword here we need to remember is the word any. So again, it checks if this condition resolves to true for any of the members of this array. And we know we already have, actually, we have 2 Ford cars. So that means even if we had only one, that would be true as well. Now, for example, we don't have a Toyota car, and that would evaluate to false because we don't have any. So sum checks this condition, returns true for any of the members. It doesn't matter which one, just one of them would be fine. On the contrary, we have every. So there is, I'm going to copy paste this one because they're kind of opposite each other. We have every that would check for every or all the elements, and they need to all evaluate to true. So if I change this back to Ford, both of them, so you can see the first one gives us true because we have at least one Ford. This one gives us false because all of them are not Ford, just 2 of them are. So this has to evaluate to true for all of them. So for example, I want to make sure that all cars are made after the year 1980. So the last one I think is this one, 1988. So 1980, if I say, and we get false. Do we have anything before 1980? Okay, sorry, I just realized I'm checking the car make. Instead, I should check the car year. That would bring true because all the cars are in fact made after the year 1980. Sorry about that mistake. So remember, sum checks for any element. If any of the elements return true, then the whole statement is true. Every checks for all the elements, and all of them must return and pass the test, and then it returns true. Next, we have reduce. That would do some calculation on every element, or on all the elements of an array. So let me show you with a simple example first. So I'm going to console.log, and I'm going to pass an array on the fly and just say 2, 3, 4. and then call reduce on it. Now reduce also takes a callback function, but this takes two parameters. One is the previous number or the previous element. The next is the next element. So it takes like this is the previous element and this is the next, and then jumps to the next iterator, and this would be previous, this would be next. And then we can do some calculations on it. We can say, for example, add them all together. So this is a good way to add all the elements of an array together, and we get 9. So the sum of all the elements. We can also do other calculations. We can do this on the strings and so on. For example, let's do a fun thing. We can get the year of all these cars and add them all together and get the sum of all these years, just to add two functions together. So first we need to call cars, of course. What we want to do, we want to get an array of the year, right? So we know already we can map that, saying car, for each car in the cars array, I only want the car year. Now I can chain the events, I'm sorry, not the events, the methods, and say, now call the reduce on it. Again, this takes a callback function that takes two parameters. In this case, I'm just going to call it A and B. And what we want to do, just add A and B together. And let's reformat the code so it looks better. And there we go. We get this number. So this is the sum of all these numbers in this array of cars, which is kind of nice. Okay, next we have find. And I think that's quite easy to understand because find finds something in an array. So if we want to find something in an array, we can just call the array and say find car in the cars array, where car is made after 2000. So the find method returns the value of the first element that passes the test. So the keyword we need to take here is the first element. You can see in our array we have many cars that are made after the year 2000, but it only returns the first one. So the first one, the zero index one, is 1995, so it skips that one and it goes to the next one, which is this infinity one, which is year 2005, and therefore we take that one. If, for example, say 2010, we have a car that is actually made in 2011, and therefore we are getting only that one. So if there is anything after that, we're not getting any of it. So find returns the first element that passes the test. Now, similar to find, we also have find index. That is very, very easy to understand because it is exactly like find, but instead of returning the value, it returns the index. So we know, for example, this Ford Fiesta 2011 is the index of 2. So if I save this one, we get 2, of course, because that object has the index of 2 in our array. So that is find and find index. Next, we have from. Now, from can be called on the array constructor. So we want to make an array from any iterable. So we can say array.from, and now we can pass any iterable, and we know strings all iterable. So I can say hello, and I get an array of all those individual letters in an array. Also, this one takes a second argument, and that would be a map function like this, but we don't actually have to say map, we can just pass in the function. So we know that takes an element or iterator, and what do we want to do? For example, we want to add 2, the number 2 to it. Let's see what happens. We get H2, E2, so we get the letters plus the number 2, and because they are strings, they are added together as a string. So again, this is from. It takes an iterable and it gives us an array from that iterable. This could be an array like 2, 3, and 4. If I say this, you can see I'm adding 2. So 2 plus 2 is 4, 2 plus 3 is 5, and so on. So the first is an array, the first argument. The second one is a map function. Next we have keys, and this is called on the object constructor. So let's call the object, and what it does, it gives us the keys of an object or any iterable object. So if I pass a string, which is again an iterable, it gives me an array of all the indexes or the keys of that iterable. So we know that has 5 letters in it. So it goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the length is 5. So we are getting an array of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now this one we can pass actually one of the cars because they are key value pairs, and we can get only the keys of that car, not the first car. So we know we have keys, make, model, and year. Now, similarly to keys, that would only gives us the index of an iterable or an object, we have entries. Now, entries actually gives us the keys and the values as a key value pairs in an array. So if I pass a simple array of 2, 3, and 4, see what happens? Let me comment this out. You see, I'm getting an array with 3 arrays in it. So an array of arrays. So we have the 0 as the index of the key, and then they have the value, which is this 2 we passed into it. And then we have index 1, which is the key, and the value is 3, and so on. So if we passed one of the cars into here, which is an object, we get an array of 3 arrays with key value pairs. Now, these are not pairs anymore. We are just getting an array with 2 elements, with one is the key, one is the value. Last but not least, we have set. So set is an object, but it's a kind of a different object. It's a set object. So if I create a set here and pass nothing into it, I just console.log that set, you can see it doesn't say object, it doesn't say array, it just says set, which is an object kind of thing, and you can iterate over it and so on. But what it does, set returns a set of unique values, or an object of unique values. So if I pass an array into this that has 2, 3, 4, and 3, and 6, and 2, and you can see I'm getting a set of 4, which is an object, that's the curly brackets, but there is no repeated value. This also goes with for strings because they are iterable. So you can say hello, that has 2 L's, but I'm getting 1 L in the object. So if you want to get something unique from the user of all the values they are entering, you can use set and you can make that unique. Okay, so that's about the methods. Now let's talk about the spread operator. And that is basically 3 dots. The spread operator breaks an iterable into individual values. So let's say I have this array of 2, 3, 4, and we can clearly here say this is an array. Now, if I provide 3 dots before that array, you can see this is called the spread operator, and you can see I'm getting the individual values instead of an array. So to show you where this is helpful, let's say I have a function and I'm gonna use the arrow function. I was gonna use the traditional, but anyway, that would add some numbers. Okay, this is a common example, and this would take x and y and z, 3 numbers, for example. And what it does is just gonna x plus y plus z. That's it. Now that means I need 3 values, right? But I want to use this array. So what I want to do, instead of console.log, I am just going to delete this, and just save this into a variable and say const nums equal to that array. Okay, so let's console.log that add nums. Okay, so that's the function. We are not passing into it anything. Of course, we're getting not a number. If we pass num, we are getting 2, 3, 4, that's an array, and then we get undefined, because that 2, 3, 4 goes to x. We actually want them separately. We want 2 to be x, 3 to be y, and 4 to be z. So we can spread it like so, and then log it. There we go, we get 9. So 2 plus 3 plus 4 is 9. So that is quite useful when you are passing values into functions. So this is also called the rest operator in the functions, which we will talk about it in the next section where we talk about functions. Okay, so the last topic, since we are in array and object, is the difference between for of and for in. We have for of and for in. So I'm just going to get the boilerplate here. So for of, it's like that, and for in is like this. I don't need this object, but I think by the boilerplate you can see what's the difference. For in brings out the keys of an iterable, so it gives us the keys, an index, if you will, and for of gives us the values. So I'm just going to pass this array into here with 3 names in it, and same thing goes here, and I'm just going to log the value for that one and log the key for this one, if I can get that one correctly. I'm pressing all the keys on my keyboard. Okay, so you can see, and let me comment that out. So you can see the for of loop is giving us the values. So John, Mike, and Jane, right? Now for in is giving us the keys 0, 1, 2. And that's the difference. For of give us the value, for in gives us the key. That's the main difference. Okay, let's talk about functions, and I'm going to keep that array of cars up there in case we need it. I don't think we do, but I'm just going to keep it. So let's talk with functions and specifically arrow functions. So we already know that a function can be declared like add, like this, add nums and take two parameters. For example, this is the traditional way, of course. Add the curly brackets and do some calculation. We are going to return x plus y, and down up here or down there, or it doesn't matter because we are using function keyword. We can say console.log add nums 2 and 2, and we get 4, of course. Now to turn this into an arrow function, we can easily just remove the function keyword and we save that as a variable. So I'm going to go use const add nums equals to, we assign it to a function. Now, the parentheses is just like the function, it takes the parameters, and then after the parentheses, we use this arrow, which would point to the curly brackets, and then we have the logic in there. So this would not work because, there we go, it says we cannot access the add nums before initialization. So keep in mind, if you are using arrow function, because we are assigning it to a variable, it has to be after the initialization. So invoking the function has to be after initializing that function or declaring that function. Okay, now if I save it, I get 4, of course. Now, since I am just returning one statement, I can get rid of this curly brackets as well as this return keyword. That would do the same thing. And you saw this approach in our array method. Now, if you are passing more than one parameters, you need to have the parentheses. Or if you are passing no parameters, you still need the parentheses. But if you're passing only one parameter, you don't need the parameters. So if it's like this, and I'm just going to return that x, and I'm just going to keep 2, and we get 2. You see, you don't need the return keyword, you don't need the parentheses, and basically saying this, return this. Now I'm going to go back to that example. Let's say a user doesn't pass any arguments into your function. So you don't want to get this not a number. So you can pass default parameters. So this is the default parameters, and we can just assign a value to that parameter of our function. So I want to say x is 0 at first and y is 0. So if a user doesn't pass anything to it, we get 0. If they pass only one number, we get that number because 3 plus 0 is 3. And if they do it, of course, the 2, it will override those two default parameters. Let's talk about the rest operator, which we talked about it briefly in the objects and arrays. So we heard about the spread operator, that was 3 dots, right? So now, let's say I want to accept as many arguments as the user passes into the function instead of just saying 2. So I can say dot 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 args. So that means the rest of the arguments. Okay, now this args is just a name. I can call it nums or whatever we want to. And for the start, let's just return this nums and see what we get. And I'm not going to pass anything into the function. I'm getting an empty array. So this is an array and we are basically breaking it, right? in in the function, because remember before we did the same thing. When we called the function, we broke an array into individual numbers. So in here, if I pass any number of elements, any number of values, it could be string, it could be an object, it could be an array or anything, and you can see it all goes inside an array. Let's say you wanted to do some calculation on these arguments. So we need to map over it. We know this is an array. So I can say map, and then for each num in the numbers, num plus 2. I don't know. For example, we can call it reduce and then add them all together, for example. So if I pass 2 and 3, I would get 4 and 5. So you get the idea. I don't have to specifically say X and Y and Z and so on. But keep in mind that this is called the rest for a reason, because you cannot say the rest of the argument and X. You can see this is already giving me an error because, sorry, an X, because it says the rest parameter must be the last in the parameter list. So you cannot say the rest and something else. You can say X and Y and the rest. That would make sense. Now, 2 and 3 are X and Y. Okay, so if I return X plus Y plus args, which is not correct, but I just want to show you what it sorry, I called it nums. It's not correct, but I just want to show you what happens. So 2 and 3 are x and y, and that's why we are getting 5. If I pass another number into this, we are getting 53, which is not correct. This is actually a string kind of thing, because this is an array. It goes 5 and 3. This is kind of a funny JavaScript thing, that because this is an array, it kind of concatenate that value to this 5 to the calculation. But this was just an example to show you what happens. We can do this and accept some arguments, yeah, and then the rest. Okay, let's talk about one of the more difficult parts of JavaScript, and that is a promise. It is difficult to understand at first, I would say, but the more you practice and the more you think about it, it's easier it gets, of course. But in a nutshell, think of a promise as a real life promise. So if I promise you to give you $5 tomorrow, you cannot spend it today because you don't have it. You have to wait until tomorrow. And these are the keywords. You have to wait until tomorrow. So it means you can say, if you give me $5, then I can buy something. So that then keyword is also something to note. Now let's create a promise just to show you how it goes. Basically, we say new promise, okay? And the promise takes a callback function which takes two parameters. So one for the resolve, one for the reject. And it's a callback function. I'm using arrow function. So, and in the body of that function, we just want to call those resolve and reject functions. So it's function within functions within functions, and see what happens. But I'm not passing really anything into it. I'm just showing you the boilerplate or the body and how it works. We are saying basically, I promise you to do something if the promise is fulfilled or resolved, or if you refuse it or if you fail to fulfill your promise, I will do something else. That's basically a promise. Now, let's save this into a variable and just log it into the console, see what we get. So you can see we say promise and we have fulfilled because there is nothing to check. So there is no failure whatsoever. We are getting fulfilled. And you can see on the prototype, we have these, then you can see that keyword we talked about. We have catch to catch the error. So we have these methods that we can call on this promise. So to actually get the result of a promise, we need to call these methods on it. So for example, promise, my promise, then do something. When I say then, whatever code we pass into this resolver or this resolve, these are just names that I picked. You can name it whatever you want. But whatever I passed in here would be evaluated or would be executed here. And then whatever I pass into the reject function will happen in this one. So these are, again, I'm just showing the boilerplate. I'm going to show you now a real example. So I'm going to delete all of this, but I'm going to keep that my promise. And this would be a num, or let me change this to check num. That would basically, I want to make a promise function that would check for a number and see how it goes. So it's an arrow function, and this would return a promise. So I am literally saying return a new promise. So we know a promise takes a callback function that takes two parameter that are functions again. So one was resolve, or we can call it resolver just to change things around, or rejector, and then use the arrow function again and say, let's check if, so a simple if statement. If the number that we are passing into the function is greater than 5, then resolve it. Then use the resolve function and say yes, greater than 5. Else, that means it's smaller than 5, we would say, we would call the rejector function. So we want to reject it and say no, smaller than 5. That's what's going to happen basically. Now, to call this function, again, remember, we need to use these functions, these other methods, then and catch. So if I was to just call this check num function and say check for number 6, which is greater than 5, so this should be called. But if I save it, I get nothing because this is returning a promise. I am not saying to do anything with this promise at this point. What I want to do, I call the then. I want to say if this promise is resolved, then do something. So then again, this takes another callback function. This might be a bit overwhelming at this point because we have functions within functions within function, but we will talk about another concept after this. So this promise says if it's resolved, what do you want me to do then? We want to say if it's resolved, take the result, okay? And again, arrow function, and just show me in the console that result. Now, if I save this one, I'm getting, yes, it's greater than 5, of course, because we said pass this string into the resolver, which is this then. So if it is fulfilled, this is going to be called. If it is not, let's say 4, this is going to fail, right? Now we are getting an error which says uncaught. That is the keyword we need to focus on. It says uncaught in promise. We are getting the value, but not in the right way, right? Not in the right way. This is an uncaught error. Uncaught errors can cause your program to crash. So what we want to do, we can say catch that error, please. And let's call it, it also takes another callback function. Let's call it error. And again, let's console.log that error, and get rid of that semicolon and save it. Now it's not uncaught. We are actually catching it. So it's not breaking our program. Now, if I reformat my code, it looks a bit better, but you can see this is basically a promise. To recap, we are creating a function that would take a number from the user and checks if that number is greater than 5 or not. But it does not give us the answer right away. It gives us in the future. It's a promise. That's what promises do. They give us the result in the future. So we need to wait for it. And therefore, because we need to wait for it, we are calling methods like then and catch to get the result in the future. We call the then method if the promise is resolved or fulfilled, which is this one. We call the catch method if the promise fails, which is this one. Now, to make this even better or look like a promise, I will add a set timeout here. So this is again a simple set timeout. We know set timeout takes a callback function and then the time in milliseconds. So after 3 seconds, I want this function to run. So this if statement can go in there. So I just added this timeout function to show you what happens in real life. For example, it takes some time until we get the results. So let's save this and we wait 3 seconds and there we go. It's an error. So it's not greater than 5. If I change this back to something greater than 5, and we wait 3 seconds, so this is getting from the server, for example, and yes, greater than 5. So that is basically a promise. And again, it can be overwhelming at first because we have function within function within function. Usually, you would not declare the function yourself. You just use it. Like in the YouTube video, remember we use fetch, and fetch is a promise. It returns a promise, and therefore we only call these two methods on it. We don't really have to care about what's happening here. But anyway, I'm going to talk about the next concept which can make this easier, but that's preference. I personally prefer this. So the next concept is async and await, and basically there are two keywords. So I'm going to delete this one, async and await. So there's a few things we need to learn. The async keyword makes a function return a promise. So I'm going to create a const add nums. This would be an arrow function and it doesn't accept anything. I just want to show you how it works. So console.log, for example, da da da. Now, this is a normal function, of course, right? If I called add nums, and let's put it in the console.log first, because I want to show you the promise part. Okay, and instead of console.log, we have to return, let's say, this. Okay, so this, of course, would give us the value. Now, if I add the keyword async just before the parentheses, that makes this one an async function. That means this would return a promise. And you can see if I save it, it gives me the promise. It says fulfilled and gives me the value, but it is a promise. So again, async keyword makes a function to return the promise. The await keyword makes a function wait for the promise, and it can only be used within the async function. So what it does, it will make the function pause at some level and then wait for the result, and then go on to the next one if it is resolved. So let me show you the fetch example. I'm going to show you the normal way, which we usually do. So for example, this dummyjson.com would give us some data we can fetch using the fetch API. So I'm going to cut this and add this to this console.log. And there we go. We get the promise, of course. Now, of course, we don't want this. We actually want to call then. We already know this one, just like the promise we made. Now, this is someone else made this promise, declared this promise. Now we just have to call then. We want the response and we want the JSON because only response itself it's just a header. We don't want it. We want the JSON data. Now, JSON function, again, this also returns a promise. You can see up here. So we need to call then again because it's another promise and say this time we will get the data and we just log that data into the console. So we already did this a few times in other videos and we know how this one works. Basically, that's what we get. We get the actual data and we are not catching any error, by the way, you can see here, but it's always a good practice to catch and be prepared for errors because you never know, maybe there is an error. So let's just log that error too. And for example, if the link was broken, we get the error and it says failed to fetch. So, all right. But basically, this is the old ways or the promise way, not the old ways, the promise way and using the fetch API using then and catch keyword, which again, I prefer this way. Now let's do the same thing with async and await. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a function, let's say const get data. And of course, this is going to be an async function because we know it's going to return a promise. We are going to fetch something. It's going to return the promise. So instead of literally, I'm sorry, this should be curly brackets. Instead of literally saying return a new promise, we just want to create another variable. Let's say let result, and I'm using let because I want to reassign to something else. Now we want to fetch this one. So I'm going to copy this, add it here. By the way, I'm going to comment this out. And we know fetch returns a promise, right? You can see here, it returns a promise. So we cannot just assign it like this. That res would be nothing. So what we want to do, we want to wait for it. And remember, I said await the await keyword makes the function stop until this is resolved. So if it is resolved, it's going to assign this result or the response from this API to the res variable we have here. So the next step, which we did here, was to get the JSON. So all I want to do, just say reassign it to res.json. Now here's again, same thing. We know, again, JSON returns another promise. That means you're gonna have to wait for it. I have to say wait for that JSON too. After I get the JSON, let's just log that res. Again, let's recap. So we are creating a function that is an async function. That means it is going to return a promise. We know we are going to work with promises. Now we are calling the fetch API on a link that we know it's going to return the promise. That means we want to wait for the result, then assign it back to our variable. On the next line, we need the JSON data. We need the JSON from that response. And again, we know this returns a promise, so we are going to wait for it. And until this one is resolved, we will wait and then assign it back to the result, and then we will console.log that result. So let's see what we get here. So I'm going to say get data. I'm just going to invoke it because there is no parameter whatsoever. Save. There we go. We get the actual data we need. Now, we are not catching for any error like here. So what we can do, we can just wrap this whole thing inside a try catch. So try catch and catch the error and console.log the error for us. Say log error. So I'm going to reformat this one and I'm going to save it. So if it breaks like this, we are getting the error. If it works, we are getting the actual data. Now, so this is the same thing as this. So you can decide for yourself which one actually works better for you. Like I said, I prefer the then, using the then and catch keyword. I prefer to use the promise way. Many people prefer the async and await because it makes it easier to read, I would say. Anyway, it's a preference, but they both give you the data, and that's what's important. All right, that's with functions and promises, async, and await, and so on. There are only two other topics left that they are actually quite easy and they can be quickly done. So I'm going to delete everything in app.js. I'm going to talk about classes, and I'm going to create another file here called it user.js, which is a class. That's why I'm using capital. That's kind of a convention thing. And what I want to do, just create a class here. And by the way, first let me just add it here so we can see in the console, user.js. So we can see in the console what we get. A class, it's created by the keyword class, of course. And I'm going to create a user class, and that's how it's done. We have user class now. Done. Anyway, but I'm gonna, sorry, I'm just gonna being silly, but I'm gonna log that into the console. We get the user class. Now, how do we pass actually data to this one? We can use constructor function on it and pass in whatever data we expect from the user. For example, I want the username and the email and maybe the status. So this is a normal function, so we know how it works. And the status, by default, I want it to be guest. So this is a user for a, like, I don't know, whatever site, for a blog or something. And to assign this to the user, we can say this.username equals to username, and it goes to, and I can say this email equals to email, and of course status is status. So I reformatted the code, and that's the constructor. So to create a user, we can come down here and say, for example, const my user, my first user or whatever, is equal to new user. So we need to use the new keyword and then pass in the name of the class, and then it accepts username, let's say John, and email should be email example.com. And I'm not going to pass the status because by default it's guest. So now instead of logging the user, I'm just going to say my user. There we go. So we have the object of user, email, status, and username. So I'm not passing email. I just noticed that one. So I'm not passing for status because I want the default. Now with classes, we can do a lot more. We can have, for example, static methods, which is quite nice. Static methods help us to call the method without having an instant of the user. So let me explain. So for example, we have a register user function here, okay? And this would take, again, username and email, let's say for at first. And then what it does, it's just gonna return a new user, which would take that username and email. And again, I'm not passing the status because it's by default, it's gonna go in. So instead of saying new user, I can say user dot register user. Again, I can call this off the user class itself. I don't need to create an instant of it with the new keyword because it's a static method. And that's the only way I can call it, in fact. Okay, so save, I still get the same thing. Now, remember, we talked about a spread and rest operator. I'm expecting parameters that are already declared up here. And I know those parameters will be the same values or arguments here. So all I can say, I'm going to say that accepts all the arguments and then pass those arguments as individual values. So I'm expecting all the arguments. This is the rest argument. And then I'm saying the rest or the individual values that user expects, because user expects a username, an email, and status with comma separated. Okay, so it's not an array, it's the individual values. That's why we are using rest and spread and this method. And again, if I save it, it doesn't give me any error. It works like a charm. So let's say we have getters and setters as well, like many other languages. We can say get, I don't know, say hi. So we want to say hi to the user when they register. For example, we want to return a template string and say hello and welcome this.username. Oops, why did I go outside this.username? There we go. So now this is a getter, okay? It's not a function. If I want to call it, if I come down here, so I have my user, right? If I say dot say hi and invoke it, this would give me an error, like you say. It's not a function, it's a getter, so I just have to call it like an attribute, if you will. So I don't know if that's the right word I used here, attribute, or I don't know, whatever. So it's a getter, so we don't need to actually invoke it. There we go. We have hello and welcome, John. So that's the username. We also have setters. We can change values with setters. And I want to change the value of status. So I'm going to call it change status, and this will take a new status parameter, and all it does is going to change the status to and take this new status to assign this new status to the status we already have. And this is a setter. Okay, so it's not a normal function. So like this right now, you can see I'm going to go back here, and you can see the status is guest. So I'm going to copy this, and in between of these two console logs, I'm going to call that my user dot change status. Now I cannot do this, so again this would be wrong. You can see error. So this is a setter. I can set it equal to, for example, VIP. Okay, so you can see here now it's VIP, before it was guest. So that's the setter. We can also have normal functions if we want. For example, we can have a change username that would take a new username, and all it would do, it would just say this that username equal to new username. So this is a normal function. It's not a setter, so we can just call it like a normal function. So down here, again, I'm going to say my user dot change username to, there we go. Now you can see username is changed, status is changed, and so on. And that's basically a class, and that's how we create classes, and we can call from anywhere within our file or JS file. So now let's take this for the last part. Let's make this into an exported class so we can import it into our module. So we want to talk about modules. So JavaScript modules, basically there are files that can be called from other places. So we use export and import. So to make this class accessible from outside, all we have to do to add the keyword export just before it. That's it. So you can see here, if I save this, now it's giving me error because I'm exporting it. I'm not using it. So ignore that error for now because we're not done. To export anything, we can just add the keyword export. You can export variables, you can export classes or data or anything you want to. And what I want to do, I want to call these functions. So I'm call these statements from within my app.js. So right now I'm getting so many errors because none of these are correct. But in the app.js, because I want to call that class user class, I need to import it. So import user, so as a object, user from user.js. So .js. Okay, so import user from user.js, which is the same file here. Now, if you can see the VS Code is already recognizing that as a class. However, if I save it, I will get another error. But look at the first one. It says cannot use import statement outside a module. So by default, the browsers don't know that if this is a module. First of all, we don't need this because we are exporting it. So we don't need to have it there. But now app is a module because we are importing other things from outside. To mark this as a module, all we have to do under script element, we should say type is module. There we go. Now we are getting intended data, and we are saying this app.js is actually a module, and the user is coming from a separate file, the user class, and we are calling it in the app.js. And that is it, guys. That is all the topics that I prepared for this video, and I hope this has been helpful, and I hope you enjoyed it. I want to thank you all for your likes, subscribes, and views, and shares, and all the support that I'm getting from you. Thank you, and see you at the next one. Bye bye.